Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. Let me first just express my gratitude to you, your scientists, your investigators who continue to work around the clock. We are so grateful. As a pediatrician, it may not surprise you that I'm going to ask about vaccinations and children. Now, as typical, studies in children and pregnant women always happen after studies in the general public for very good reasons. And children themselves generally, at least with these variants, have very mild or no symptoms. So the risk-benefit calculations are also different. And every day in practice, I encountered vaccine hesitant parents, and I expect the same will happen here. And one thing that I think would change the parents' risk-benefit calculation is whether the vaccines prevent transmission. In other words, giving Johnny the vaccine means Johnny can visit grandma and won't bring the virus home from school to his parents. And some of my colleagues have touched on this issue of transmissibility. Chairman Pallone asked about studies at Pfizer, Representative Rice asked about studies at AstraZeneca. And so I was just wondering, could our other witnesses comment on this, maybe starting with Dr. Hogue?
Sorry, I was fumbling with mute. So we are actively studying the vaccine in 12 to 18 population, enrolling the study very quickly, and moving into younger populations in the near term.
And any studies of whether the vaccine whether Moderna prevents transmissibility?
Oh, yes. We have seen some early data that we presented to the FDA showing a decrease in asymptomatic infections between the first and second dose. The data that will hopefully support that evidence more broadly is evolving and will be a part of our subsequent filings. We don't have any data yet, but we are studying it actively.
Thank you. And Dr. Nettles, did you have anything to add to that issue of studying transmissibility and what your early findings are?
We are deep diving into our phase 3 clinical trial results in Ensemble. Was just mentioned, to understand what is the impact on asymptomatic disease from our vaccine. We hope to bring forward that after discussions with the FDA.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Trezino, did you want to add anything about transmissibility and what you're finding?
Thank you for the question. We are expecting to start pediatric studies in the spring. We believe, as you do, that it's important for us to get data, safety data, and particularly about that population. We're looking at our clinical trials now for transmissibility and looking at future studies in that regard, but don't have any data to share today.
Thank you. I have another question. This is about pediatric studies because Dr. Trezino, you just mentioned looking at safety in children. I was wondering, Mr. Young, can I ask you about how studies in children are different? Like the studies in adults look for endpoints of severe disease and death, but that's not a reasonable endpoint to look at in children because that doesn't happen for the most part. Can you talk about what you're using as endpoints, whether that's antigen testing, you name it? How are you designing those studies?
No, thank you for the question. So as I mentioned in my comments, we have an ongoing study in children between the ages of 12 to 15 years, and we hope to initiate a study in children under the age of 11 later on this year. The endpoints in those studies are primarily safety, as my colleagues have mentioned. We know that that is of primary importance. And then we're also going to look to demonstrate immunogenicity. And in the course of those studies, obviously we'll look at reactogenicity, which is what I call the normal effects that you would see when your body begins to produce an immune response. So we'll be able to collect all of these data and hope to submit those to the FDA later on this year.
That's great. So that would imply effectiveness if you have evidence of immunity. I have a little bit of time left, and I thought I would ask about pregnant women because, of course, the studies are later because you want to test it in the general population first. And yet now this is really being left up to pregnant women and their OBGYNs to decide whether to recommend it. My discussions with ACOG suggest that most obstetricians are recommending it because although pregnant women are not at higher risk for contracting it, they are, I believe, 70% more likely to die of COVID. And I was wondering if you could talk about your studies in pregnant women and what you're finding. Sorry, I should go to Mr. Young.
No, thank you. We actually initiated a study in pregnant women just last week. So that study is obviously in the early stages of recruiting patients. And again, we want to make sure that that study from an endpoint perspective can demonstrate safety for the mum, safety for the baby, as well as obviously the immunogenicity data that would enable that vaccine potentially to be approved for use in pregnant women. So that study is ongoing and we'll move as quickly as we possibly can.
And anything real life out of Israel?
That's a really good question. We potentially are going to be in a position where we may have real world data for women who became pregnant after being vaccinated. And so that's an additional set of real world data that could potentially complement that formal randomized clinical control trial.
Thank you very much. I'm over time. Yield back.